Hey film fans, welcome to Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and this is the 25th episode of What Makes This Film Great. I started this channel, or this iteration of this channel, just over a year ago, and I did have plans to do a little bit more of these in the last year, but I've also done a few of the Break the Scene videos. I did the whole series on the rise and fall of New Hollywood, which if you haven't seen it, check it out in my videos. And then a few one-offs like some ranking of Hal Ashby films, of Fast and Furious films. Yep, that's down there. And a few other one-offs, and I'll continue to do those. But this has kind of been the bread and butter of the channel, what makes this film great. And I'm really happy that you've come along for this ride. Thankful to everybody who has watched the videos, of course, but also shared them, commented upon them, told their friends about them, and so on. So I'm going to try to get out 25 more in the next year, maybe even more. We'll see. And I thought that with this episode, I could do two things. First, I'm going to tie up this mini-series I've been doing on gritty 70s crime films. This will be the last entry in that, for now anyway. But also kind of jump back to the beginning in a sort of full circle kind of way. The first video I did in this series was for the film The Heartbreak Kid, directed by Elaine May. So I thought I'd do, for the 25th video in the series, another Elaine May film. So join me as we discuss the gritty crime, or maybe even anti-crime film, Mikey and Nicky, in this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Mikey and Nicky is a 1976 film written and directed by Elaine May. It features the cinematography of Victor Kemper and the editing of John Carter, both of those with caveats. The production was protracted. It was shot at night. There was a lot of frustration. It took a lot longer than expected, and it was also cut and released in a version without May's approval and then re-released a few years later. So Kemper was the primary cinematographer, but if you look the film up on IMDb or elsewhere, you'll see that other cinematographers worked on the film as well. Same with Carter. Carter was the principal editor, and he had also worked with Elaine May on The Heartbreak Kid, and I talk a little bit more about him and his importance as one of the first African-American editors in Hollywood in that video, which you can check out here. Paul Sylbert, the great 70s production designer and the brother of Richard Sylbert, another great 70s production designer, is credited as production designer, and he talks a lot about having worked on the film. But his wife, Anthea Sylbert, also worked on the film. And there is talk, there is speculation that she actually did most of the production design. She's credited as a visual consultant, but the reason for that might be because she wasn't in the union. And it was very difficult, not just for women, but for anybody really in Hollywood, to get work on a union picture if you weren't in the union. And there was this real sort of catch-22 situation, there still is, where you can't get in the union unless you've worked on a union picture, but you can't get work on a union picture unless you're in the union. And tons of people, cinematographers, editors, production designers, have story after story about trying to break into that catch-22 circle. So Anthea Sylbert, another sort of New Hollywood wife who doesn't get the credit she deserves sometimes, mostly known as a costume designer, did a lot of the work on the sort of tight interiors and the gritty, grimy interiors in the film. So that's worth mentioning. And it features a low-key score by John Strauss. It has that kind of 70s crime, jazzy crime vibe to it that some of the other films in this series we've talked about have, but it's much subtler and much lower key. There's not a lot of score going on in the film, really. And it stars, it's almost what's sometimes called a two-hander. So it stars Peter Falk as Mikey and John Cassavetes as Nicky. And they're in nearly every scene, at least one of them. except for a couple of exceptions, and it's almost only about them. Having said that, however, there is a stellar supporting cast, including Ned Beatty with some crazy hair as a hired killer, and a really wonderful performance by Carol Grace as Nellie. And if you look closely, you'll see the great character actor Emmet Walsh show up as a bus driver in a really funny, or maybe not so funny, scene. Briefly, what the movie's about, it's very simple, probably the simplest story on its surface anyway of any of these crime dramas. There's no confusion, there's no ambiguity. The story's quite straight, at least in terms of the narrative. Mikey and Nicky are small-time criminals involved in a criminal organization. Both of them have been climbing the ladder, although it seems at different rates. It seems that Cassavetes' Nicky's a little bit higher up on the ladder. These two men are friends, as were Falk and Cassavetes in real life. And they've been friends since childhood. And we find that out slowly in snippets of conversation throughout the film, but you know it pretty clearly from the beginning. And that friendship and the state of that friendship is a really important part of the film and what the film's about, both in terms of its narrative, but also in terms of its sort of sub-narrative thematic issues that are really what the film's about. And the story is simple. Nicky has pissed off the mob. He has gotten himself into trouble and there's a hit on him. And the film opens with him in a state of sort of fight or flight, in danger. He's holed up in a hotel room. He knows the hit's out on him. He doesn't know what he's going to do. So he calls his friend Mikey, who's in the good graces of the mob bosses, to help him get out of town. Mikey, unbeknownst to Nicky, although suspected by Nicky, is actually working for the mob to get Nicky somewhere where a hit can be taken out on him. So you can see there's some really rich material here. Two best friends who've come up together. One of them's higher in the ranks, the one who's looking to prove himself by helping to get his best friend murdered. The whole film takes place over one night. There's a lot of walking and talking. There's not a lot of crime in the film. There are a few instances, but there is a lot of sudden violence in the film. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. So that's basically the story. Two friends trying to get away while one secretly plots to have the other murdered, which the other kind of knows. And it's sort of about who can run out the clock the longest, who can survive this night, and do they want to survive the night? What do they actually want out of this experience? We come to see that they're estranged. We come to see that things haven't been great for them recently. But we also come to see that throughout their lives there are these touch point moments. The death of Nicky's mother a few years earlier. The death of Mikey's brother at age 10 when they were still little boys. Other experiences throughout the film that tie these men intimately together. So even as they're both trying to sort of win the night, which means the other one losing the night, they're also trying to figure out what their friendship means, what their feelings for each other mean, and can they survive this evening with their friendship intact? And one of the sort of tragedies of the film is the dawning realization that they both have that the answer to that question is probably not. Before moving on to sort of analyze the film and talk about what makes it great, I want to talk about a concept that is probably going to give some of you the heebie-jeebies a little bit just hearing the term, because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot these days and some people respond to it quite negatively, and I think its use and its meaning vary depending on who's using the term and why, and that's the concept of toxic masculinity. And the reason I bring this up is because when you read contemporary reviews of Mikey and Nicky, the term comes up over and over and over again. The film was recently released just a few years ago on a Criterion Collection DVD, And with that release, as often happens with Criterion editions, there were lots of reviews and reevaluations of the film and so on. And if you go and read some of those reviews, you're going to hear, or you're going to read rather, over and over, Elaine May's investigation of toxic masculinity. And toxic masculinity is a concept that I am very interested in. I am not a sociologist or a psychologist, but I am a feminist or pro-feminist film scholar who is interested in the depictions of gender, the way gender works in front of the camera on screen, but also behind the camera. I think if you've been watching my channel for the last year, that's not a surprise to you. And I think that I'm also interested in the way Elaine May investigates masculinity generally, but also toxic masculinity. And this came up, I didn't use the term, but it came up pretty clearly in that discussion of The Heartbreak Kid from last year. So I thought I'd just talk about what the term means to me. I'll try to be brief. This isn't a sort of woke SJW lecture for all you out there. But it's a term that has resonance and that I think has value, not just in talking about this film, but in talking about this film. So it's worth unpacking, if I use the term, sort of what I mean. When some people hear the term toxic masculinity, their immediate reaction is, this is an attack on all masculinity. This is an attack on all men. So you get this hashtag, not all men, and so on. And that is explicitly not the case, at least in terms of how the concept was first presented and developed by the scholars and sort of men's movement people. And by men's movement, I don't mean the men's rights movement, but the men's movement of the sort of 80s and 90s, who first developed this term. They were very clear that they weren't talking about anything that can be described as masculinity. What they're talking about, and why they use the term toxic, is behavior that is at once normalized by society, by families, whatever, but is also harmful or potentially harmful. Potentially harmful, I think, is very important there. So we can go into this in a lot of detail, and I don't want to do that, but a general idea is that boys, men, are often not socialized to communicate their feelings. And so they often grow up not knowing how to communicate their feelings. And I don't just mean feelings like love and affection, although that's part of it, but also anger. Like, how does one communicate anger in a healthy way that leads to resolution? That's a very important life skill. And of course, men learn this skill, some men learn this skill, but a lot of them don't. And, or I should say, a lot of us don't. And it's normalized through seemingly simple, seemingly harmless socialization practices. For example, when a boy at school pulls a girl's hair, and then it turns out that he actually really likes her, and everybody's like, ha ha ha, boys will be boys. That is a practice of societal normalization where the boy is taught, don't communicate to the girl. Don't tell the girl that you like her, that you care for her, that you have feelings for her. Do violence to her, and the institutions that are meant to protect children will think it's okay because boys will be boys. This is a simplification. But when you get thousands of boys will be boys in your life, it's normalized. That's what normalization means. And so there's two things going on in there, and these are very relevant to the film, as you'll see. I'm not just trying to lecture you, but it's good knowing the context about what May's trying to do here, I think, in her deconstruction of this friendship. So the boys and men are not taught, or let's say are rarely taught, to communicate and express their feelings in healthy ways, but they are taught to express themselves through violence. And that violence can be towards other boys, schoolyard fights, bullying, And I know girls do this too, but I'm not talking about girls right now. I'm talking about boys. And violence against girls, right? Which, as they grow up, becomes the potential for violence against women. And go look at the statistics. So this is what is meant by toxic masculinity, and it's compounded by the sort of patriarchal structure of society that places men, particularly straight, white, cis men, at the top of the pinnacle. So black men can exhibit toxic masculinity. Gay men exhibit toxic masculinity. All men can exhibit toxic masculinity from all walks of life. Rich men, poor men, and so on. But when we have a hierarchical society that puts men on top of women, and that puts white men on top of black men or Asian men or Hispanic men or whoever, and that puts straight men on top of gay men and so on, you get another process going on there. This is well documented and well written about, and it's not just about men and others, it's also about foreigners, and it's about all kinds of different things, ageism and so on, and that's the process of othering. And very simply, the process of othering is when there's a group, a like group, and that group can be anyone. It can be men, it can be boys, it can be white people, it can be Americans, it can be Irish, it can be Europeans, it can be old people, young people, rich people, poor people, so on, right? And when that group defines itself in a certain way, and then it sees people who aren't in that group as others, as different, right? There's a normal part of human development that does this. You know, we go back through history and we learned to regard the stranger or the foreigner in the sort of older sense as someone who's just not from here as a potential threat. That's not othering, that's caution. And then you go, "Hi, stranger, wherefore art thou coming here?" "Oh, I'm traveling to the church on my pilgrimage. Do you have a bite to eat?" "Yes, I do." "Let's swap stories." "Oh, I've got a bottle of mead here." "Okay, you're not a threat." And then it's over. Othering is a step further, where those people outside the in-group become less than, become two-dimensional, become stereotypes, become, in a way, non-human, right? And this process happens, like most obviously, during times of war, right? So one country's at war with another country, we come up with all kinds of epithets, racial, national epithets for them. We two-dimensionalize them as slaves to their leader, as evil, and as a threat, and it makes it easier to go and kill them. That's othering. But it happens in lots of other ways as well. And what you have in a sort of patriarchal society is, you didn't know this was coming when you clicked play. What you have in a patriarchal society is a sort of hierarchical structure with, as I said, straight, white, cis men, probably rich at the top. And every instance of difference creates potential for othering. One of the most common ones throughout history is the dehumanization or dehumanizing of women. Certainly of people with different skin colors or different kind of ethnicities or anything like that. And humans have done this throughout history. I don't say that to excuse it. It's something we need to learn from and get better at not doing. Practice of othering and enfold it into what I described as toxic masculinity, which is the potential really to harm others or to harm oneself too. Like when men's rights people say, well, men commit suicide more often, part of that is a result also of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity doesn't just hurt others, it hurts men as well. It's this potential to do harm. And when there's a potential there to do harm all the time, to do violence, then, and at the same time, there is a series or a categorical series of othered groups, it becomes easier, sometimes even desirable, to do violence against them. There's a kind of a chauvinism there that's with an undergirding of violence. And this is what toxic masculinity is. Toxic masculinity isn't the guy with big muscles who bursts into the burning house and saves the little kid, right? That's heroism, that's to be celebrated, or whatever it is. Toxic masculinity isn't like the guy who buys you roses on your birthday or whatever, you know? Toxic masculinity isn't like a firm jawline or shaving or any of those things. It's the socialization and normalization of behaviors with the potential to do harm to others and calling those behaviors masculine. That's the toxic part. Lesson over, but please keep that in mind. I hope you haven't tuned out, because this is what Mikey and Nicky is about. And when all those commentators writing their new reviews of the DVD use toxic masculinity, they're not trying to be woke warriors or SJWs or anything like that. They're just describing what the film is actually about. So let's have a look. The film starts in the middle of things, or in medias res, you could say, and you can tell that by looking at the state of Nicky's hotel room. Everything is a mess, strewn about the room, so we know that this isn't the beginning of something, this is the middle of something. And almost immediately, he makes a phone call, and the toxicity starts to creep in from the very beginning. Now, we could describe what he says to Mikey as just self-preservation, but let's have a quick look.
Mikey? I'm in trouble. Can you talk? I'm in a phone booth, Martel and Grand, the southwest side of the street. All right? Don't bring your own car. All right? Don't come all the way with the taxi. Stop around 3 blocks and then walk the rest of the way, all right? The phone booth, all right? All right. Bring cigarettes, huh?
One of the things you'll note throughout the film, particularly in the early parts before Nicky gets a chance to kind of gauge where Mikey's coming from, but throughout the whole film, is that Nicky's incredibly paranoid. As well he should be. There's a mark on his head. But he starts the film, he starts the process of this night of sort of friendship, discovery, escape, betrayal, and so on with a lie. And I think that's important. Yes, it is self-preservation. Yes, he wants to make sure that Mikey comes alone, that he's not, you know, doesn't have a sniper rifle and all those sorts of things. But also, he's lying to his best friend. And that's an important foundation for where the film is going to go. Because when Mikey shows up, Mikey's also lying. He's lying by omission, because he has come to get Nicky and take him to the place where the hit can go down. So they're both lying to each other from the beginning, and this is that instance, or that act, or that inability of being able to tell each other the truth, to be able to tell each other what they think, what they feel, and so on. However, there are some sort of hints or feints in that direction. For example, when Mikey shows up, Nicky won't let him into the room at first. He's freaking out. Mikey's banging on the door. There's a funny part where he references this old-timey American song that I love. Open the door, Richard.
Open the door, Nicky. Open the door and let me in. Nick, you're gonna have to let me in now. I don't know the rest of the tune.
And then he finally comes in, and we get this moment.
Look at you, Nick. Great steak. Hey, come here. Come here.
gonna die.
Come on, stop that.
God damn it.
All right, I'm scared. I know you are.
Oh, boy. I am so scared.
That's nice. That's one of the only times they sort of touch each other with affection. They're going to fight later. There's going to be physical contact between the two men. They grab each other a lot. They're going to actually come to fisticuffs later in the film. This is the one time where they kind of display the deep emotional connection that they have. And the film will hint at it again in spots, but never as dramatically as here. And then Mickey opens this whole opening part by showing his concern for Nicky. Nicky has an ulcer. Mikey knows about it, and Mikey is concerned. And this is a kind of a lovely part of the film because we actually haven't found out yet that Mikey's in on the hit, but we will soon. This is a super minor spoiler. So these opening scenes really seem like these are two guys who are here to help each other out, when actually it's all deception, it's all deceit. But we get our first scene of real sort of toxic masculinity when Mikey goes out to get some milk or some half and half for Nicky to help him with his ulcer, and he goes into a kind of an all-night diner, and we get this scene. And one of the things I love about this scene is that it opens in this kind of typical Hollywood misunderstanding about the rules and the way they work, and it's very reminiscent of the chicken salad scene in 5 Easy Pieces. But then it turns. Let's have a look.
Give me some milk and some cream in separate cartons to go.
Just got milk.
No cream?
Not to go.
What do you put in the coffee here? You have any cream?
Use these little bottles here.
All right, give me 15 of those little bottles to go. Give me a couple of cartons of milk.
Can't do that. We don't give these bottles to go. If you want coffee to go, I put the cream in it right here and I use the dispenser right back there, sir.
All right, give me a carton of cream from the dispenser.
How many coffees?
Well, no coffees, just fill up a carton of cream.
Can't do that. I wouldn't know what to charge you. Cream is for the coffee only. It's not for sale.
Charge me for 15 coffees and give me the cream.
15 coffees?
That's right.
Okay.
You give me that in 30 seconds, you hear me, or I'll kill you.
Okay, sir.
Because I'm crazy.
Okay.
Now give it to me.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Just give it to me.
Okay. Okay.
Give it to me. Come near me and I'll kill you.
This scene is important for a lot of reasons. It comes just over 10 minutes into the film, and it shows us several things. First of all, it shows us this is a blatant display of toxic masculinity. It definitely wouldn't have been called that then, because that term kind of came into usage in the 80s and really into the 90s. But Mikey isn't getting what he wants in the way he wants it, as quickly as he wants it, so he resorts to what he knows best, which is violence. He's going to do violence to this stranger just because the stranger is trying to do his job, and that's not what Mikey wants. There's also something in there about toxic masculinity, which I didn't mention in the lecture part, which is the constant fear or the constant worry about being made a fool of, the constant fear or worry about not being respected for where one is on the hierarchy. In the world of Philadelphia, this is set in Philadelphia, in the world of Philadelphia gangsterism, Mikey's kind of, I don't know, halfway, a third to halfway up the totem pole. He's a middleman. But in the world of the street, he's a made guy. He's a gangster. And this petty little late night diner idiot or else. But also for the film, thematically, this is really important, I think, because it sets the stage clearly for what's in store for Nicky. Mikey is not what he appears to be. Mikey is not the sort of nice but curmudgeonly, sort of impatient, gruff guy like Peter Falk plays so well. He's a hot wire, ready to bring the violence, to bring the pain to Nicky, and that's what he's doing. And although throughout the film Mikey will soften up to Nicky on occasion, he always comes back to this line. He's always ready to finger Nicky whenever the opportunity arises. And the scene in the diner, I think, sets that up and makes that incredibly clear.